wanted to speak with you this morning about the gospel and about being healed of sinfulness and the uncleanness within. To really understand the gospel and the predicament in which this woman found herself, you need to know something about the religious culture of the first century. This was a woman who had a flow of blood, and according to the understandings of Jewish religion and come to that of pagan religion, religion said that if you have a flow of blood like that, it makes you ceremonially or ritually unclean. Now you've got to understand that being unclean had nothing to do with moral failing. It did not mean that she had done anything wrong, that she had sinned, that God was mad at her. This had nothing to do with moral failing or guilt. It had everything to do with your ritual state before God. So that if you were unclean through that particular flow of blood, or after childbirth, or any of these other things, until the uncleanness was rectified, until the flow stopped, and until you had purified yourself by washing yourself in water, you could not offer sacrifice to God, you could not touch holy things, and anyone that touched you was made similarly unclean. So this was a problem. It's like a living leprosy in the sense that it separates you from the worship of God and it separates you from your fellow man. We tend to say, of course, you can pray, and prayer is good. A Jew could pray if he was in a state of uncleanness, but he was not able to offer sacrifice while in a state of uncleanness. And we tend to forget that the communion with God in the Old Testament was not just through prayer. That you could do at home, that you could do in the synagogue, clean or unclean. Communion with God, however, was through sacrifice, and this could only be done at the central shrine at the temple in Zion, and it was there that the essential worship of God was enacted. It was there that if you wanted to have communion with Him, cleansing with Him, if you wanted to invoke His blessing, if you wanted to receive His divine forgiveness, if you wanted to have any of these things, you had to do it through sacrifice. And it was just this very avenue of access which was denied her. Because of her flow of blood, she was in a perpetual state of uncleanness, and anyone that touched her was rendered unclean until evening as well. So as you can imagine, this didn't just crimp her social life a little bit. It ultimately destroyed all of her human communion and authentic relationships with all sorts of people. So she was confined to the isolation of this living spiritual death. So this is a problem, and she hears that Jesus, the wonder worker, the prophet from Galilee, is there, the one who it was said could cleanse lepers and open the eyes of the blind, and she realizes that her only hope of being restored to communion with God, her only hope of being restored to a kind of a normal relationship with her friends and family, is to have Jesus heal her. So there is, however, a problem. That is to say, she, technically speaking, cannot go into a crowd and touch people without rendering them unclean, and they are really choked at you if you do this. This is not, they're not philosophical about this. See, she is supposed to know better than that. If she's unclean, stay away. If a leper was unclean, you're supposed to put your hand over your mouth and say, unclean, unclean, stay away. You don't mingle with people. So this is a problem. What are you going to do? Send Jesus a little text message, excuse me, sir, I'm unclean, can you meet with me privately? No, Jesus lives in the middle of this tremendous traffic jam. Whenever he would go into a city, he would be more or less so swarmed and mobbed by all sorts of people. Mark's gospel said that there were such crowds in the city that he had to stay outside the city, and the people would come to him from outside the city. So this is a problem. He's in the midst of this crowd, and you can't get to him without rendering the crowd unclean. And you can't touch him without rendering him Levitically and ceremonially and ritually unclean. So she comes up with a cunning plan, as Baldrick would say. She thought that she will sneak through the crowd. You don't tell people that you're unclean, so you sneak through the crowd, push through the crowd, rendering all of these people unclean, and you come up behind him, and you thought, if I just touch the fringe of his garment, I will be healed. And the fringe of his garment was almost certainly the little tassels that the pious Jews would wear on the corners of their robes. And the nice part about touching the tassels or the hem of his garment is that you don't know that you've been touched. He's being jostled by all these people. If you grab him by the arm to make that tactile saving contact, well, you know that someone's grabbed you by the arm. But if you just grip the tassels and then let them go in faith, she realizes, with the understanding of that day, that just as uncleanness is kind of transmitted through touch, so the saving power of God is transmitted through touch. That's, by the way, what the sacramental laying on of hands is all about. So, comes up into the crowd, goes to the crowd. This person's all unclean, but they don't know. And then she takes them by the tassels and feels the warmth and the power of God enter her body, and she is clean, she is healed, and she thought, perfect, I'll just slip away and no one will be any of the wiser. And then Christ stops dead in the crowd and says, who touched me? She figures, oh my goodness, I am so busted. So everybody stops, and you've got to understand, as we learned from the story of Jairus' daughter, there is some need for haste. The synagogue ruler came to Jesus, blurted out this story, and says, my daughter is on the verge of death. In Matthew's gospel, it says, my daughter has just died. Saying, which did he say? Probably said both. This guy is beside himself. Said, my daughter's dead. She's dying. She's, So they're kind of go through the crowd to the ruler's house as fast as they can. If you're surrounded by 300 people, you can't move very quickly. You ever try to move in a crowd? It doesn't work terribly well. So they're kind of inching along. The synagogue ruler's heart is kind of dying in the midst of his body at the slow pace, and she's thinking, my daughter's going to be dead by the time we get there. And in the midst of this need for haste, Jesus stops dead and says something apparently stupid like, who touched me? Mark's gospel, Peter said, Master, the crowd's, who touched you? The crowd's thronging you, pressing you. Everybody touched you. And he said, someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone forth from me. She realizes there is no hiding. Now, you know how the story ends, but you have to understand that this is a problem. If you lie to a prophet, if you fool a prophet, this is very ungood. This is a dangerous thing to do. Remember, there was a chap by the name of Gehazi who thought that he would try to fool the prophet of God. You recall the story in the Old Testament. Of course, Elisha had just cured Naaman the Syrian of his leprosy, another cleansing of someone that had been unclean. And Naaman, in his great joy, offered him all sorts of gifts in gratitude. And he says, no, let your gifts be for yourself. So off Naaman goes, and Gehazi, Elisha's servant, thinks, what was this? We could have cashed in on this thing. So he, unbeknownst to Elijah, chases after Naaman and comes up with this story. Actually, now that we think of it, we've just now, these people will come to visit. And so it would be very handy if we could have that gift. Thank you very much. So he gets the stuff, takes it, goes into his tent, buries the thing, and Elisha says, where did you go? He says, go? I didn't go anywhere. I just went. He said, is this the time to be receiving gifts? And now behold, you are cursed, and the leprosy that has vanished from Naaman the Syrian will cling to you forever. And he went out from the prophet white with leprosy. What's the moral to the story? The moral to the story is it's not nice to try to fool the prophets. And that's what this woman has done. She has gone in there, tried to fool the prophets, making everybody, including Jesus, ceremonially unclean, and she was expecting that sort of rebuke. She was expecting that sort of punishment for trying to fool the prophet from Galilee. She expected something like, behold, your disease is back and will cling to you forever, And so you can imagine, but he says, who touched me? This is a very dangerous question, but she's busted already. So she comes and tells him everything. And instead of the expected rebuke, she hears the words, daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. And then the story goes on. The story is instructive for us because we equally, with that woman, are afflicted with a disease. Not a physical disease, but a spiritual disease. We are unclean within, even as she was kind of physically unclean without. And so the question is, how do we get rid of this spiritual uncleanness? How do we be healed of the disease of sin? Because our problem is not just that we're guilty, that too, but the guilt can be taken care of in a baptismal moment. As St. Peter says, baptism now saves you. You are baptized in the name of the Holy Trinity, and you are chrismated, and then your guilt is remitted. You are forgiven. You emerge from the baptismal font completely forgiven.